All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to EER session 1C on end use load shapes and energy efficiency programs in planning and development. My name is Mike Spiecian, and I'm a utilities manager at ACEEE, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. We're going to start this webcast in just a few moments, but first I want to give some housekeeping announcements and then quickly move on to our presenters, followed by Q&A. First and foremost, I want to give a very hearty thank you to all of our sponsors and ally members for their support of the Energy Efficiency as a Resource Conference and ACEEE. I will note that for all attendees, you will be in listen-only mode throughout the webcast. But if there is an attendee you would like to connect with, please use the attendees link on the left-hand side column of the Socio platform. All registrants are listed alphabetically. Also, on the left-hand side, you can find a resources section. Resources contains a copy of the program in PDF format, an attendee list for downloading, Zoom links for all of the chats and discussions, and an evaluation form that we ask everyone to complete after they view their last session. And anyone who completes the evaluation and includes their name and a testimonial will receive $25 discount to attend the 2023 National Conference on Energy Efficiency as a Resource in Philadelphia. And all presentations will be available for on-demand viewing within a few days of this engagement hub. Presenters' PowerPoints can also be found on their page in the Program Participants section. I want to keep my rest of my remarks brief so we could devote our time to the content presented that will be presented by our three excellent speakers today. I'll start by saying that the process of obtaining end-use load shapes or savings load shapes involves strong data collection and good models, and then applications to put it to use. And our three speakers today are going to reflect the full range of that activity. We're going to start with David Clement, who will provide an overview of the Northwest End-Use Load Research Project, which includes end-use data measured before and after the pandemic, or during, I suppose. Then we're going to transition to Eric Wilson, who will talk to us about an exciting new end-use load profiles project that has been years in the making. That data set will be announced next Thursday, I believe, but we're going to get a preview of that work in just a few minutes. And then we'll welcome Alex Thiessen, who will talk about application of load shapes in IRP and scenario analysis, including a focus on natural gas. So from collecting the data to building the load shape models and putting them to use, this session will have you covered. Each of our speakers will have 12 to 14 minutes for their presentation, and then we will reserve the balance of the hour for a moderated discussion driven by your questions. If you would like to ask a question of the presenters, please use the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. As moderator, I will be sharing your questions with the presenters following the presentation as time allows. And once this session ends at 3:15 Eastern or 12:15 Pacific, all the presenters will move to the Zoom platform for another 20 minutes of chat, discussions, and Q&A. So watch for the Zoom link to be posted in the chat during the session or download it in the resources section as mentioned earlier. And please refrain from using the chat for any dialogue other than asking questions. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. I am very happy to introduce first David Clement from the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. He leads the Northwest End-Use Load Research Project, which is a collaborative effort of 14 regional and national organizations consisting of the Home Energy Metering Study, HEMS, and the Commercial Energy Metering Study. David has previously led IRPs for the utility Seattle City Light and was also the director of the electric transmission in the Western Energy Services at Cambridge Energy Research Associates and consulted on regulatory policy, regional transmission organization, market design, integrated resource planning, renewables development, and institutional energy investments. David, I'm happy to invite you to please kick us off.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike. Today, I'd like to tell you about the Northwest End-Use Load Research Project, but also about its measured impacts from the pandemic on residential electricity demand. In 1990, the LCAP study, or the End-Use Load and Consumer Assessment Program, was complete. It was a large-scale, first-of-a-kind study. It invented equipment and methods that are very much still used today. It was a very good study, but things have changed. A lack of good substitutes has kept some utilities continuing to use 30-year-old data from LCAP. This chart compares lighting load profiles from the 2012 RBSA study and the LCAP study in 1990. And as you can see, there's a substantial difference. Just between 1990 and 2012, there's nearly a 60% error for lighting load. Large end-use studies are complex and expensive. A group of Northwest utilities came together to collaborate in 2016.
Hey, David, sorry to interrupt. It looks like your slides are not currently being shared.
Oh.
Yeah, and that middle button should say share screen.
Yeah. When I hit share, it's not sharing.
Oh, okay. I wonder if our producer has slides in backup that we could run and automate?
Yes, give me one moment and I will see if I can grab David's slides.
All right, thanks. Sorry, David.
Yeah, no problem. These things happen.
Yes, I've seen a comment from the chat. Thank you, Chris, for pointing that out. The PDFs of all the presentations are accessible on the lower part of the page, and they can also be accessed through the Socio app. So if we are unable to pull them up in a worst case scenario, we can ask people to follow along.
Did I just get it to work?
Let's see.
Can you see it now?
Not yet, no. There it is, you got it.
Okay. All right, apologies, people. I just think I finally figured it out. So I was showing this slide earlier about the nearly 60% error in older data being misrepresentative. This is comparing 1990 and 2012 data. And then for our project sponsors, this group decided to collaborate in 2016, and just 2 years later, they had funded the project, they designed it, and had actually hired a consulting firm, and were in the field doing metering. Well, many of us think about end-use load research as supporting energy efficiency. The fact is that it has substantial value in many other applications. The working group identified 6 categories of value coming from the end-use load research. First of all, energy efficiency. The region spends over $350 million every year, and small changes can add up to big dollar savings. Demand response, you can find what the expected benefit from implementing a demand response program can be. Load forecasting, many utilities changed to econometric and end-use models recently, and the end-use data is helpful in improving forecasting accuracy. Integrated resource planning spans several uses, but of course the demand forecasting, but also helps to identify what types of flexible resources might be needed and what expected energy efficiency saving shapes might be. For transmission and distribution, capacity is always a big worry, and the ability to determine what the peak might be on a long radial line is always important. And for financial planning and rate making, if you have a variable rate, then the load shapes can help predicting revenue. And then for rate making, the demand charge is always an important part of rate making. And this can help to provide actual data to estimate what that demand charge should be. Well, the working group designed a residential study and a commercial study. The residential study will eventually have 400 homes, and the commercial study will eventually meter 100 buildings targeting office and retail. But what is truly unique about these metering studies is that they are connected to the residential building stock assessment and the commercial building stock assessment. The sampling for the participants actually comes from those studies, so that we're able to directly link those studies to particular homes and know exactly what the structure is, the size, the insulation, the windows, the occupants, demographics, types of HVAC, model numbers, and much more. Well, the way that we capture the data is using a box that we install next to the circuit panel. The box is wired to the circuit panel, and it contains an E-gauge meter, a receiver for temperature sensors, and also a cellular modem. The temperature sensors are placed on heat pumps, wood stoves, and fireplaces. In addition, there's a temperature sensor placed in the home. The data, which is anonymous, is pushed to the cloud by the cellular modem. The 1-minute data has a real advantage for some end uses. This is actually a site that we're metering that has a heat pump. And what this slide depicts is the 1-minute data in blue, the 15-minute data in gold, and the 60-minute data in green. And as you can see, even the 15-minute data, which is quite good, doesn't quite pick up the amount of cycling nor the peak demand of the heat pump. Well, now I'd like to turn our attention to the impacts of COVID-19 on residential electricity demand. This study wasn't designed to measure COVID-19 impacts, but having 200 homes across the Northwest metering allowed us to be positioned to be able to understand those impacts. Early in the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty, and we had reports coming from utilities and other organizations of load growth in residential as much as 20%. This slide shows the overall metered impacts of COVID-19 on whole home load shapes over an 11-month period, just short of a year. And as you can see, the amount of change was roughly 6.3% during midday of an increase, and then a decrease of minus 3.1%. The red line depicts the actual load, and the blue line is showing a model load. The model load is done for each home, and it is using their pre-COVID demand by circuit, and it's also temperature adjusted. Well, one of the things we noticed when observing this data early in the pandemic was that the impacts did not seem to be uniform throughout the period. This slide represents different phases in the pandemic, And these were determined by using Google mobility data and the structure, or rather the different government restrictions that were placed. Phase 1 and Phase 4 had the highest number of cases and were the worst parts of this time period for the pandemic. They also had the largest changes. Phase 3, which was the summer of 2020 into the fall through November, had very little change. And that's because many of the government restrictions were loosened and people spent a lot more time outdoors or traveling. Moving on to an example of an individual end use, electric vehicles saw some pretty significant changes in the amount of charging that occurred. This sample only had 4 that are being averaged here, and that's because we only had a full year of pre-pandemic data for 4 of them. One of the unexpected things we found was that ductless heat pumps actually had lower demand during that period. And we hypothesize that this is because with more people at home, both working and schooling, there was more interest in heating the entire home rather than in a particular area. Well, this is probably no surprise to most of us. People spent a lot more time in the kitchen during COVID-19. And here we have change in dishwasher loads, refrigerators, and stoves. Stoves had the biggest impact, and we can see it in virtually all hours increases in the kitchen load. Well, the kitchen, cooking, cleaning, and also things like people showering at home instead of the gym or at school and doing laundry during midday resulted in an increased load for hot water. Hot water, in fact, the load from hot water the change was actually much greater than from the kitchen, the entire kitchen. Well, as I mentioned, the study wasn't designed to look specifically at COVID. And so we actually had a category that we couldn't meter directly. We called additional load, which is primarily made up of plug loads and lighting. And that load was actually the largest change that we saw in the data. That would be followed on the basis of scale by hot water, kitchen, and laundry. Well, in 2019, the steering committee for this project voted to make 15-minute data free to download to anyone. That was despite having already just committed $12.5 million to the study. And their rationale for doing this was that they were hoping to promote energy efficiency throughout the country. And so this data is publicly available on nia.org at a 15-minute interval. On the page shown to the right, it's asking for how you intend to use the data and can your analysis be shared. And the hope is to build a library of analyses to help promote energy efficiency and learning from this data set. Well, we've been designing a residential and commercial study. We've metered and analyzed billions of data points. And yeah, this is a one-of-a-kind study, at least for now. And it is our hope that we can continue to use this information in an interesting way. For example, PricewaterhouseCoopers had conducted a survey where they determined that 83% of employers felt that the transition to remote working was successful. At the same time, 55% of employees were preferring to work from home at least 3 days a week. So will load shapes return to their pre-pandemic levels? Probably not. So as we continue to meter, we'll monitor future end uses loads and be able to track this and hopefully report back on what those changes were. Well, thank you for listening. There is a white paper on NEA.org that covers all of this material in more depth, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you very much, David. A reminder to everyone in the room, if you have any questions for the presenters, please deposit them in the chat box as they occur to you, and afterwards we'll be sure to get to them. All right, next up is Eric Wilson from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Eric is a senior researcher in the Buildings and Thermal Sciences Center at NREL. Eric conducts research on building energy use and demand flexibility at local, regional, and national scales. He also leads a team of researchers working on the development and application of ResStock, a simulation framework for residential building stock analysis. Eric, I throw it to you.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, David, for doing a great introduction to end-use load research. I'm going to be things up and talking about a different approach to developing end-use load profiles. So if there's one you take away from my presentation today, it's that we will be announcing a new data set of our end-use load profiles that represent all residential and commercial buildings in the contiguous US in just 9 days from now, a week from Thursday. And there'll be different ways of accessing that. So feel free to join our webinar. You can register at our project's website. So the submetering approach that David described for developing end-use load profiles is very important part and very important for our industry. But the challenge that we were up against was how to develop a nationally comprehensive end-use data set that covers all building types and end uses. And if you scale up from just one region and up to the whole country and all building types, it was prohibitively expensive to try to do that with a submetering study. So with that, the Department of Energy Building Technologies Office funded a 3-year project. The project team included 3 national laboratories and several industries. And there were 60 organizations that were represented on our technical advisory group. And I'm sure some of these organizations are represented by folks listening. So thank you all for participating. We couldn't have done it without the guidance and feedback that we got from you all over these past 3 years. So how did we do this? So the solution we came up with was a hybrid approach. And this sort of approach had been used in some cases in the past, but nothing really large scale. So first, we leverage decades of DOE investment in building energy modeling with the Energy Plus and OpenStudio tools, and then more recently, their investments in the ResStock and Comstock simulation models that use physics-based models to represent the whole US building stock. And we combine those building stock models with the best available load data that we were able to obtain and use that load data to calibrate and validate our models. And this was done through over 70 improvements to those models that were supported by data on the building stock. And are publishing all of the accuracy and uncertainty metrics from all of these validation comparisons so that users of the data set can know what confidence to have when applying it. So ultimately, this delivers a nationally comprehensive data set that's a fraction of what it would cost to do a submetering study for the whole country. And more importantly is that we end up with calibrated models that can then be used to look at what if scenarios about deploying deficiency or electrification technologies. And to be clear, those impacts are outside the scope of this current study, but the fact that we ended up with calibrated and validated models meant that we're now enabled, we're enabling the ability to look at these impacts in the future. So touching on each of these components in a little bit more detail, over the past several years, the Department of Energy has funded the development of the ResStock and Comstock tools to represent the US building stock. And these use thousands or hundreds of thousands building energy models that were built up using the Energy Plus engine and the OpenStudio software development kit to represent the diversity of the building stock. It's quite different from the prototype model type approach that has been used largely in the past. And to do this, draw from a large detailed database of building stock kicks to represent the diversity of building characteristics that exist in the building stock. And these models inherently produce hourly load profiles, but their calibration before this project had really only focused on annual energy consumption. So what empirical data do we have access to? I think it's fair to say that the data gathering effort for the project was really unprecedented. We were very fortunate to work with a lot of great utility partners, and ultimately we obtained data from over 2.3 million meters worth of data covering all climate regions of the US from 11 different utilities. And this emphasizing that this was a slow process to work through all the requirements for privacy and anonymizing data and things like that. And it's also really worth emphasizing the fact that for commercial buildings, we needed to know the building and the floor area that each meter was serving in order for us to compare it against our model outputs. So this involved a pretty complex process to associate each meter data set with data about each premise served by that. This was made more complicated because of COVID. Originally, we were planning on traveling out to utilities and working with utility staff to do this address matching process. So ultimately, we had to come up with a different approach to do that and work with utilities remote in order to go through this process. But ultimately, we were successful in doing this and got access to this large data set to compare our models to. Now, I think we're all aware that utility meters only tells us the whole building energy rate. It doesn't tell us the end use breakouts. You get a pretty good signal from weather, heating and cooling loads, but for the other end uses, we need to supplement with other data sources. So here for the residential calibration effort, we're just showing the spectrum of data source that we used for calibration. So there were 8 different utilities, as we showed on that previous map, that we had AMI data from, and we supplemented that with a variety of EIA data that were available at a monthly or annual scale. And then on the residential side, we were lucky to have access to 5 end-use load data, sub-metered end-use load data sets, 2 of which were from NEA, and these were kind of readily available to be used for the calibration work that we needed to do. And then finally, for residential, we also had access to whole sector customer class load shapes, sometimes called load research data, from 16 additional utilities around the country. On the commercial side, we had 10 AMI data sets from around the country, again, supplemented with EIA data. And the sub-meter end use data for commercial buildings really did not exist. You know, we have the NEA's ongoing commercial metering study, but no data from that was available to use for this project. And there weren't any other data sources out there. So we had to do kind of this additional outreach process to talk to 100 different organizations and try to obtain commercial end use data, and in some cases get creative in going after data sets that weren't developed to be shared at all, or for this type of research. So one example of that is building automation system data. But in the end, we procured 16 commercial end use data sets that we were able to use for calibration for this project. So what did calibration look like? I think it's, I mentioned that we made over 70 model improvements that were supported by building stock data. I think it's important to emphasize that calibration did not involve tuning model inputs, whether that's manual tuning or automatic tuning, in order to try to minimize model error. In some cases, you have to do that when you're trying to calibrate an individual building model because you don't know anything about that actual building. But in our case, because we were modeling the whole stock, our approach was to go out and find better data about the building stock, whether that's increased accuracy or diversity of characteristics or geographic resolution, for example, and update our models with that improved data about the stock in order to get a better match against the calibration data. And some of the data sets we use for this are shown here. And all of these model updates that we made will be thoroughly documented in a report that will be coming out later this winter. Okay, finally, we are publishing all of the comparisons to empirical data that we did as part of this project. All the data we got from utilities, we are not able to republish that. We got it under NDA in most cases, and we're not able to publish that. But what we are able to publish is the comparison of how our model outputs compare against that empirical data. So there will be many of those types of comparisons, both graphical and then with other types of metrics that will be included in the report coming later this winter. I'm going to show one example here of this type of accuracy comparison before and after the calibration process. On the before side, we have two of the load research data that we're comparing against, one from Baltimore Gas and Electric and the other from ERCOT in Texas. And we're just showing an average summer and winter season 24-hour profile here for these, and just showing the error in the peak magnitude in each of these cases. And that was before calibration. After calibration, it's a different year of weather and load data, but you can see that we now get a much better match between our model outputs and the empirical data, which is pretty exciting to see because we did not focus on either of these two regions as part of our focused calibration efforts. But we did see quite a bit of improvement here for these two locations. In some cases, the errors that we see are much larger. And one thing that was an important takeaway from this project is that there can be a lot of uncertainty in the empirical data that we were comparing against, especially for some commercial building types where the sample sizes were quite small. But we are striving just to be transparent and to publish all of these comparisons that we were making in this report so that users can decide whether they want to use them or not. And then the other thing that was an interesting finding is that we sometimes saw where the empirical data sources disagreed with each other. So we didn't know which we should have more confidence in when comparing our model outputs against. Okay, with that, just want to summarize the 3 different ways that we'll be making this data set available. And again, we'll be announcing this in a little bit more detail 9 days from now on a webinar. So the first method is with pre-aggregated files. So we'll be making publicly available pre-aggregated CSV files that can be opened in Microsoft Excel that are organized by building type. So the sum of all of a given type in a certain geographic region, whether that's or climate zone or even down to county. And those will be available for 2 different years of weather, 2018 weather, and also a typical weather year. Secondly, we'll be making available a website data viewer so that users can go in and make their own custom aggregations. And it uses big data tools behind the scenes to do these aggregations on the full data set of results. So for example, I wanted to look at in California, all single family homes that use electric water heating or that use heat pump water heaters for water heating. Go into the data set and filter down to just that subset of homes and download a CSV of 15-minute resolution, years worth of data can be downloaded directly from the web viewer there. And then finally, we are making available a pathway to access the full raw database of results from the 900,000 building energy models. It's quite a large data set. For users who are up for it, they can learn how to query that large data set. And as part of this, we'll also make available the OpenStudio building energy models so that building energy modelers can use those their own custom analyses. And then just to summarize, we'll be able to go into a little bit more detail on this on our public webinar that we'll be giving in 9 days from now. But I'm happy to answer questions you might have during our question and answer session. Thank you.
All right, and thank you, Eric. If any of you guys have questions right now, feel free to throw those into the chat. Before we get to those, our third and final speaker for this session is Alex Thiessen. Alex is a founding partner of Posterity Group and has 15 years experience helping utilities and governments understand end-use energy within their jurisdictions to make informed energy resource planning, demand-side management, and policy decisions. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. Welcome everybody to the, I guess the third presentation of the session. I'm going to share insights from our experience with some of North America's largest gas utilities, where we've been modeling volume and peak impacts on their systems to support long-term resource planning and decarbonization scenario planning activities. While David and Eric have presented engaging details on electric end-use load shape research, I'm going to focus on gas end-use shapes and how we're applying these load shapes to understand impacts on gas utility system peaks. The U.S. Department of Energy's 2019 report on end-use load profiles for the U.S. building stock identified 60 unique use cases for end-use load profiles. A use case is defined as any type of process or analysis that uses end-use load profiles. The report synthesizes and groups these unique use cases into a standardized top 10 list, which are the 10 use cases listed on this slide. The examples I'm covering today specifically touch on the 5 highlighted cases. For example, we will look at how end-use load shapes are being applied in the long-term resource planning process to assess peak impacts resulting from policy changes, including electrification planning. We will show how calibrated load shapes are an important input to our bottom-up end-use based modeling approach, which is based on jurisdictional building energy model archetypes. And we will see how peak impact scenarios can have meaningful effects on long-term transmission and distribution system design. Scenario planning is an important tool to help us reach net zero before 2050. Many critical decisions need to be made over the next decade by policymakers and utilities to accelerate and successfully achieve a decarbonized energy transition. To do this well, utility planners require an understanding of how and when energy is used under different decarbonization pathways. Hourly annual end-use load shapes are an important input to the long-term utility resource planning process. Accurate assignment, allocation, and calibration of load shapes lets utility planners understand the end-use distribution of peak loads over different intervals, at different locations across their service territories, and under different supply fuel choice scenarios. Granular bottom-up modeling of peak load using end-use load shapes allows utilities and regulators to understand how distribution infrastructure investments and energy supply procurement requirements vary across different scenarios. End-use based long-term planning, including analysis of peak system impacts, is a well-established practice within electric utilities. However, this practice is beginning to gain broader acceptance within gas utilities. Why is this the case? Gas utilities need to understand how their companies will take part in a decarbonized future, and this unquestionably means major changes to their system. Traditional long-term volume supply forecasts are no longer sufficient for gas utilities to answer questions like, how can geo-targeted DSM reduce the requirement for pipeline extensions and reinforcements? Does the implementation of non-pipe alternatives, like end-use electrification, energy efficiency, or demand response, alleviate current system peak constraints, but perhaps introduce a new peak hour at a different time of day? How will planned policies like carbon pricing codes and standards impact system design requirements? What about climate change forecasts? Today, I want to share 3 examples of how load profile integration enables quantification of peak impacts. We will cover peak impacts resulting from policy-driven fuel switching and load reduction through mechanisms like carbon price and codes and standards for new and existing built environment, climate change due to warming average temperatures and climate extremes, and new supply options and new demand. For example, hydrogen supply and increased transportation demand. Jurisdictional decarbonization commitments will be met through a combination of policy mandates, corporate actions, technology development, and customer behaviors. There are obviously numerous non-policy related drivers that will influence how gas utility customers will use energy, like commodity costs, GDP, and population growth. For this example, though, we will briefly focus on policy drivers. We work with utilities to identify specific policy drivers that could impact system peak and annual volumes over the next 10 to 30 years. And why is this important? Because changes will result in downward pressure on system requirements. In other words, lower system peaks and potentially significantly lower peaks. And these changes will vary depending on regional sectoral characteristics. Common drivers that we have helped explore include carbon price, where changes in carbon price lead to fuel switching from one fuel to another based on long-run price elasticity assumptions. Electrification, for example, customers switching from gas to electricity for reasons other than price, such as policies that limit the use of natural gas, stringent building codes, or incentives that encourage switching from gas to low carbon or electric technologies. And codes and standards for new and existing buildings, which involves estimating the timing and impact at an end-use level of code and standard changes that are being planned or drafted. Examples include energy codes, retrofit codes, energy efficiency regulations, and community energy plans. Accurate and calibrated space heating, HVAC, and water heating end-use load shapes are important inputs for modeling peak impacts. We typically start with load shapes developed from specific utility research or data sets and research like David and Eric have discussed. These load shapes are then calibrated to utility hydraulic model outputs. Similar to the hydraulic model outputs, which start at a very detailed level geographically and roll up to larger zones and regions, modeling with end-use load shapes is also a bottom-up approach. But rather than rolling up different regional gate stations, we're rolling up peak information starting at the end-use level into whole buildings, segments, sectors, and regions. This graph shows example peak day hourly load profiles by sector for space heating loads. For this example jurisdiction, you can see the coincident heating-driven peak occurring in the morning. Integration of load shapes helps us understand that service territory regions with higher densities of residential and commercial customers may see larger peak system impacts from carbon price, electrification, and codes and standards. The example dashboards on this slide compare peak impacts in the residential sector, the dashboard on the left, to peak impacts in the industrial sector, the dashboard on the right, where the blue bars are the reference case daily peak in therms per day for the next 15 years, and the yellow bars are the forecasted daily peak if a theoretical high carbon price, high electrification, and high code stringency scenario ends up developing. Climate change is already affecting average temperatures, and we continue to face the risk of new climate extremes in every region across North America and the world. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its sixth assessment report this summer, confirming human-induced, widespread, and rapid climate system changes have occurred. In its fifth assessment report, it outlined various representative concentration pathways that have been used to model possible average temperature increases. As some of us have also unfortunately experienced recently, climate anomalies and extremes are already occurring, like the cold snap in Texas earlier this year. Why is this important? Because climate change will potentially result in a dichotomy of forces, where there will be lower average system requirements, but peak design requirements for customers may remain in some jurisdictions. Because weather-sensitive loads are big drivers of system peak, increased average temperatures could result in lower system peak. The Climate Change Group at York University's Laboratory of Mathematical Parallel Systems has generated projections for climate change in Ontario using the IPCC's RCP emission concentration scenarios. The example we're showing here looks at heating impacts of the RCP 8.5 scenario, which has remained a useful upper bound for mid-century worst-case average temperature change predictions. The graph shows changes in heating demand compared to the reference case. You can see these changes range from 10 to 20% depending on what sector we're looking at, due to each sector's specific weather elasticity of demand. Integration of load shapes helps us understand warming average temperatures could have noticeable impact on system peaks because space heating and HVAC end uses make up a large percentage of peak contribution. For simplicity, this example is only looking at changes to average temperature. So of course, climate extremes could nullify these impacts. The example dashboard on this slide shows the peak system impact looking at all sectors if a theoretical high emission concentration scenario unfolds, where the blue bars are the reference case daily peak in therms per day for the next 15 years, and the yellow bars are the forecasted daily peak. To the right of the dashboard is a chart that shows residential end-use contribution to peak for a cold climate. We can see the space heating is a main driver of system peak, which is why we can see impacts at the system level when weather-dependent heating loads begin to change. In this third and last example, we will briefly focus on drivers that could increase system peak. We will look at two cases. Hydrogen supply, where gas utilities are exploring options for hydrogen blending with traditional fossil-based natural gas, as well as the possibility of dedicated hydrogen networks, perhaps serving industrial clusters. And transportation demand. This includes traditional fossil-based fuel demand for natural gas vehicles and marine transportation, for example, container ships. It also includes demand for alternative fuels, for example, hydrogen being supplied in the future through the distribution system for vehicles or marine shipping. Why is this important? Because new supply alternatives and new demand will lead to increased pressure on system requirements. Service territory regions with higher densities of industrial customers who are most likely to look to hydrogen as a decarbonization strategy, and new transportation loads, for example, marine ports, may see larger system impacts. Let's look at hydrogen a little closer. Because the volumetric energy density of hydrogen is about 1/3 of natural gas, blending hydrogen or serving customers with dedicated hydrogen increases system peak requirements. The example dashboard on this slide shows the peak system impact looking at all sectors if a theoretical high hydrogen blend scenario takes place in the future, where the blue bars are the reference case daily peak in therms per day for the next 15 years, and the yellow bars are the forecasted daily peak. Now let's look at transportation demand. The dashboard on this slide shows an example utility service node and the impact on system peak if a high natural gas vehicle scenario unfolds in that region. New transportation loads clearly increase peak, but these loads may be suitable for interruptible rates or demand response approaches to mitigate peak impacts. Let's recap what we've talked about. Policies like carbon price, electrification mandates, and codes and standards for new and existing built environment could have significant impacts on peak system requirements. Accurate and calibrated space heating, HVAC, and water heating end-use load shapes are important inputs for modeling these peak impacts. These policies will result in downward pressure on system peak, and service territory regions with higher densities of residential and commercial customers may see larger peak reductions. Warming average temperatures could lower peak system requirements, while climate extremes may mean traditional peak assumptions need to be maintained or increased. Weather-sensitive loads like space heating and HVAC end uses make up a large percentage of peak contribution. An accurate integration of these load shapes is important to understand peak impacts of climate change. Climate change contributes to a dichotomy of forces. There may be lower average system requirements, but peak design requirements for customers may remain. And introducing alternative gaseous fuels like hydrogen and serving new customer demands in transportation could result in increased peak system requirements in some areas. In the case of hydrogen, load shapes are amplified by differences in volumetric energy density. Service territory regions with higher densities of industrial customers who are most likely to look to hydrogen as a decarbonization strategy, and new transportation loads, for example, marine ports, may see larger system impacts. Thanks very much for your interest. I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
And thank you very much, Alex. At this point, I'm going to welcome back in David and Eric into the chat so we can have a moderated Q&A. As a reminder, if anyone in the audience would like to pose a question to any of our speakers, please feel free to enter that into the chat on the right, and I will translate those questions directly to our speakers. Maybe I can kick us off by going back to where we started, David, and that was on the pandemic. We saw some data that you presented that showed changes in load profiles due to COVID. I have two questions for you with respect to that. The first is, how do we know, I mean, I guess you have a good guess, but how do we know how much of the changes we are observing is actually due to the pandemic versus being mixed in with some other sort of signal or change? And the second question is, have you done any comparisons or seen any comparisons between the COVID-induced changes in the Pacific Northwest versus any other areas of the country? And if so, are there any conclusions that you draw from that?
Well, going to the first question, Mike, the way we approached testing what was caused by the pandemic is by modeling each individual home using pre-pandemic data for their energy consumption. And then we compared that to the actual consumption during the pandemic. Both of those were adjusted for weather so that we've removed any weather impacts. The only remaining impacts are largely COVID. We know if there was a change in occupancy. We conduct a survey each year and are able to track that. So, we're pretty confident that what we're identifying is the impact of the pandemic. On your second question, it's a little difficult to say. Yes, there were other organizations around the country reporting change, but they may not have been reporting change over the same time period. And one of the things we found is that the impacts of COVID varied through the March through November period. So we did see Pecan Street reporting a 20% change in residential demand in their sample, although it wasn't clear whether or not they'd done any weather normalization. We saw, I believe it was the Bureau of Economic Research did a study of the Midwest, and they did do some weather normalization, and they came up with a 10% change in demand. That might be in comparison to the Northwest, driven by higher AC load. The Northwest has a lot less air conditioning load than the Midwest. And then we also saw a study by San Diego Gas and Electric, where DNV analyzed their data and determined that they had a 5% increase in residential demand driven by COVID. So, it's a kind of a potpourri of different studies over different time periods using different methods. But so that's what we had to reference.
Mm-hmm. Eric, I'll extend the topic to you because we have an extraordinary effort by you and your team to take a tremendous amount of data to calibrate these models and provide this, what is hopefully going to be an excellent resource and a vast improvement over what's available in the status quo. But then layered on top of that is this gigantic systemic change that happened during this process that is potentially permanently changing some load profiles. I wonder, have you given any thought to how the changes induced by the pandemic will influence real load profiles relative to what will exist in your well-calibrated models? And if so, are there particular end-use categories which are, maybe the uncertainty has gotten larger as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I've definitely given this some thought. We get asked this question a lot. And I think it's worth emphasizing, what David stated is that you kind of see that the impact of COVID became less and less over time. So I think we'll have to see what the kind of lasting effect will be in terms of people's behavior and commercial real estate and things like that. And yeah, and just to be clear, all the data we were comparing against was pre-pandemic. And the thing I'll point out is that the way our models work is they use a lot of data sources that are routinely collected from the US Census Bureau, for example, or commercial real estate data. Or we also use the American Time Use Survey, where every year thousands of people report kind of what they were doing on a minute-by-minute basis and fill out time diaries. So one thing we'll be able to do once new data sources from all these different sources are published, and it will lag a few years, but once those data sources are available, we'll be able to use them to generate new model inputs, run our models again, so that we can start to incorporate some of these effects into our models and take into account some of the effects, like people are staying home more than they did previously, or there's a lot less commercial office space than there was before. So eventually our models will catch up and be able to capture some of these effects. Ultimately, I'm not saying that we won't need to do another calibration effort that may be necessary, years down the line, but our models will have some longevity because we can update a lot of these inputs from data sources that are regularly collected.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And, we also heard Alex talk a bit in his presentation about peak. I think all of us who are, I assume everyone on this call is pretty well aware of what happened in February in Texas and the danger of, not just or not just the promise of saving energy on a sort of blue sky days, but these more extreme cases where loads really skyrocket. The extreme cases can be, literally the difference between life and death and billions of dollars in damages or not. And currently we know that for example, the Texas Public Utility Commission is considering how are we going to address these issues? Is energy efficiency going to be a part of that? Could any of you speak to the ways in which the work that you're doing can be tied in to looking at, understanding, or ultimately addressing the more extreme cases of peak demand that have been so impactful lately?
I can start if we have time. I know it looks like we might get moved over to the Zoom link. I touched on it in my presentation. Obviously, throughout, from a gas utility perspective and from electric utility perspective, planning around peaks extremely important. And I think having multiple scenarios to consider when planning is important, and it's what we're doing with utility clients, trying to push the upper boundary to see what that means in their service territory if we make assumptions on a climate extreme impact from a heating load perspective.
Thanks, Alex. I'm sorry we actually don't have time to continue more of these questions. We've hit 3:15, which means we are at the hour. So allow me to, on behalf of everyone in attendance, to thank our speakers for their presentations. And thank you all for listening in today. Again, if you would like to continue exploring these topics, please feel free to follow us to the Zoom chat. You can see right there in the chat, ACEEE Conferences has posted a link to continue with us. So I hope to see you, some of you over there. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.